What if a single telegram could set two nations on fire? In July 1870, a polite conversation between a king and an ambassador should have ended a crisis, but when Chancellor Bismarck received the report, he cut it down, sharpened its edges, and released it to the press. The short text landed in Paris like a slap across the face of national honor. Within days, France declared war. How could one brief message, stripped and rephrased, trigger a conflict that redrew Europe's map? That is the story of the Ems Dispatch. How could a single European battle years earlier leave France nursing a wound that shaped the next conflict? Let's move back to 1866, when Prussia defeated Austria at the Battle of Königgrätz, also called Sadova. This clash wasn't just a duel between two armies. It ended centuries of Austrian dominance over the German-speaking lands. The victory brought the dismantling of the old German Confederation and replaced it with a new structure centered under Prussian leadership. Overnight, the power map of Central Europe looked different. For France, that sudden shift was unsettling. The traditional balance between Paris, Vienna, and Berlin had been upended, and France had not been able to stop it. The effect on French politics was immediate. Revanche pour Sadova became a phrase repeated in newspapers and clubs, meaning revenge for Sadova. It was more than military resentment. French leaders felt humiliated that they had been spectators rather than players in the rearrangement of Germany. They feared isolation while Prussia grew stronger. Every diplomatic discussion in Paris seemed to circle back to the same frustration. Austria had been beaten, Prussia had become the new weight in Central Europe, and the French Second Empire looked weaker. Napoleon III tried to negotiate compensation in Belgium or Luxembourg, but these efforts had either failed or drawn international suspicion. Each failure deepened the sense that France had been sidelined in Europe's affairs. On the Prussian side, new confidence rose. King Wilhelm I, quiet and cautious by temperament, found himself at the head of a victorious army system built by reforms of his generals and ministers. Bismarck, his chancellor, saw beyond the battlefield. He believed that only with France's defeat could Germany be unified into a modern nation-state. The northern German states now accepted Prussia's leadership, forming the North German Confederation, but the southern states, Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden, remained aloof. Bismarck calculated that only an external threat could pull those reluctant Germans into unity. And that threat, he believed, would be France. Here lies the rivalry: Napoleon III's France and Wilhelm's Prussia eyeing each other, both with deep anxieties. Napoleon III's health was weakening. His empire was politically fragile, threatened by opposition at home and mockery abroad. Many in his circle felt that a successful war would restore the emperor's prestige and revive loyalty from a restless population. In Berlin, the leadership saw opportunity. A conflict with France could be the final act of unification. The wider continent watched nervously. Austria, still licking its wounds, stayed distant, suspicious of both Berlin and Paris. Russia remembered its recent humiliation in the Crimean War and preferred to avoid entanglement. Britain, balancing trade and empire, aimed to stand aside. No nation was eager to commit, leaving the stage open. But this very lack of firm alliances meant that if France and Prussia clashed, the fight could expand rapidly, with no one to hold it back. The air was heavy with suspicion. French newspapers published caricatures of Prussian soldiers, warning of encirclement and German aggression. In Berlin, pamphlets portrayed France as jealous, decadent, and ready to lash out. Border garrisons watched each other. Diplomatic salons whispered constantly of plots and provocations. Yet neither government could admit openly that war was near. Both sides claimed they wished for peace, even as their militaries prepared. By the late 1860s, the picture was clear. France carried pride wounded by Sadowa, and Prussia carried ambition sharpened by victory. Napoleon III's empire needed a triumph abroad to strengthen itself at home, while Bismarck's Germany needed France's opposition in order to unite the South with the North. The situation resembled a dry forest after a hot summer. All it required was a spark, and the whole landscape would ignite. And the unexpected spark came not from the Rhine or the Seine, but from far to the southwest. Spain, shaken by revolution and without a monarch, began searching for a new king. This vacancy, distant though it seemed, was destined to trigger the crisis both France and Prussia had been waiting for. Why would a vacant throne in Spain send shivers through Paris? In 1868, Spain had overthrown Queen Isabella II after years of turmoil, leaving behind a country without a monarch and a government eager to restore stability. Political factions in Madrid searched across Europe for candidates who could restore order and legitimacy. They wanted a king who would be acceptable both at home and abroad. And in their search, they turned to princely families scattered across the continent. What seemed like a domestic Spanish issue suddenly became a matter of high politics, because whoever wore that crown could shift the balance of power in Europe. One name rising out of this confusion was Prince Leopold of Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen. He was part of a Catholic branch of the Hohenzollern family, which also gave Prussia its king, Wilhelm I. That link to Berlin transformed his candidacy into something larger than an internal Spanish solution. For the government in Madrid, Leopold combined desirable traits. He was noble, Catholic, and connected to strong allies abroad. But in Paris, the announcement of his candidacy was viewed with alarm. If a prince linked to Prussia also became King of Spain, France would feel surrounded, Germans on the Rhine to the east and on the Pyrenees to the south. This sense of encirclement was not merely strategic, but psychological. France in the late 1860s was already uneasy after Prussia's rapid rise following Sadowa. Voices in the French press warned that Europe was tilting in Germany's favor. Now, the thought of a Prussian cousin on the Spanish throne seemed like proof that France might be cut off from influence entirely. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Paris received word of Leopold's possible candidacy and regarded it as a national danger. In the climate of honor that guided 19th century politics, allowing the plan to succeed without protest would be seen at home as unbearable weakness. Napoleon III, already weakened by illness and beset by opponents questioning his legitimacy, faced a dilemma. If he tolerated Leopold's candidacy, his own people would accuse him of cowardice. French newspapers, already mocking his foreign policy failures in Luxembourg and Belgium, would seize on it as further proof that his empire was fading. On the other hand, confronting Prussia over Spain risked escalation. Yet the emperor had little choice. He was trapped between the logic of diplomacy and the demands of public honor. By early July 1870, the pressure had worked. Leopold quietly withdrew his candidacy on July 11th. On the surface, the storm seemed to pass. The German court expressed relief, Spanish negotiators looked for alternatives, and Wilhelm I felt the affair was over. But Paris was not satisfied. It was not enough that Leopold had stepped aside once. The French government demanded a permanent commitment, that no Hohenzollern, at any point in the future, could seek the Spanish throne again. This demand shifted the dispute from Spanish politics to a direct confrontation between France and Prussia. Wilhelm I had not sponsored Leopold's candidacy in the first place, though he had permitted it. Now, he was asked to renounce not only this attempt, but every possible future attempt by any relative. That meant binding his dynasty in advance to satisfy French pride. In Berlin, ministers saw this as an unreasonable demand. In Paris, leaders saw it as the only way to secure French dignity. With that, the Spanish crisis turned into a European power contest. The human element here is striking. Napoleon III's weakness made him more defensive, more ready to insist on symbolic guarantees, because retreat would further damage him before the French public. Meanwhile, King Wilhelm I, approaching his 70s, was courteous and deliberate, not prone to rash actions. To such a king, the French demand felt like a personal insult, as if he were being treated as subordinate, commanded to swear off decisions before they even arose. Historians often pause here, noting how the affair could have ended in early July with Leopold's withdrawal. Instead, the additional insistence on a never-again guarantee moved the story along a different track. This was no longer a matter of who would rule Spain. It had become a test of pride, of national standing, and of the boundaries of respect between governments. A solved problem was transformed into a larger crisis because neither France nor Prussia could afford to step back without losing face. What this shows is how political crises in 19th century Europe were often less about practical outcomes and more about honor. Spain needed a king, yes, But the actual choice of king mattered less to Madrid than to Paris or Berlin. For Spain, the throne was about stability. For France and Prussia, it became an issue of status. Europe would soon discover how quickly honor could outweigh practical politics. So, by mid-July, with Leopold gone yet pride inflamed, the two great powers edged toward confrontation. The issue was unresolved, and tension only grew sharper. The next act of this story unfolded not in Madrid or Berlin, but in a quiet spa town where King Wilhelm was taking the waters. Along the Lahn River in Ems, the French ambassador approached the king during his daily walk, setting in motion an encounter that would produce one of the most famous telegrams in European history. Imagine a king strolling by a fountain in a spa town, thinking only of fresh air and the mineral waters. Nearby, visitors took their morning walks, reading papers or speaking quietly in shaded paths. On July 13, 1870, Wilhelm I of Prussia followed his routine in Ems, a retreat he valued for health and quiet. He was a 73-year-old monarch, polite in manner, reserved in conversation, more soldier than diplomat. Yet on this morning, a brief encounter with France's ambassador would hand Europe the material for a crisis far greater than the town's calm could suggest. The French envoy approached him in this relaxed setting. Count Vincent Benedetti, experienced and loyal to Napoleon III, carried the instructions to push one more time on the Spanish question. France had already secured Leopold's withdrawal from candidacy, but Paris was not content with that apparent settlement. What they wanted now was a promise that no Hohenzollern would ever again pursue Spain's throne. For them, it was the only way to erase the danger of being surrounded. For Wilhelm, it sounded less like a diplomatic safeguard and more like a demand to limit his family's freedom for all future generations. As they spoke, Wilhelm remained measured. He listened as Benedetti pressed the matter. The king confirmed that Leopold had indeed stepped aside and said plainly that the affair in his eyes was closed. But when it came to signing on to a permanent guarantee, he gently refused. He did not see himself in a position to make such a commitment, and he did not intend to insult with a sharp reply. Instead, he kept the tone courteous. The conversation ended without raised voices or public quarrel. Onlookers would have seen nothing more remarkable than two men exchanging a few words before parting. This is where the atmosphere matters. Europe's capitals expected drama, but at Ems there was none. Benedetti did not storm away, and Wilhelm did not slam down ultimatums. They had spoken respectfully, if firmly, each defending the position of his government. In fact, the king extended the courtesy of another meeting the same day, though he left open whether circumstances would allow it. When he returned to his lodgings, he felt he had handled the matter in decent form. The ambassador, too, could report that he had carried out his instructions. Nothing about that morning suggested headlines or outrage. Still, perception is shaped by how events are recorded. Heinrich Ebecken, who accompanied Wilhelm, drafted a telegram to Berlin describing what had occurred. His wording mentioned how Benedetti pursued the guarantee, a persistency summarized as importunity. That word shifted nuance, highlighting the sense of repeated pressure rather than simple inquiry. Yet even in his account, there was no accusation of rudeness, no hint that the men had quarreled. It was, as the king intended, a simple closure. Had things ended at that moment, the meeting might have vanished into the background of European diplomacy. Leaders would have moved on, Spanish affairs would have continued, and Paris might have found some other grievance to elevate. Bismarck himself later said that the facts as they stood were ordinary, unlikely to rouse anything more than minor irritation. What transformed this small exchange into an international trigger was not the words spoken beside the fountain, but what those words became once shaped into a statement for wider eyes. The quiet morning stroll, then, hides something important. In political life, the strength of an event is often not in what took place, but in how it is told afterward. Two men met. One pressed for a permanent promise. The other declined politely. Neither wanted war from this routine. Neither believed that his brief words would echo beyond the town. Yet tucked into Ebecken's dispatch was the essential raw detail that would allow someone else, someone more calculated and daring, to turn the scene into fuel. So the king's report crossed the wires toward Berlin. And in the capital, Otto von Bismarck waited, already known for his ability to sharpen documents into weapons. He now possessed a text that, in its current form, described nothing sensational, but with a stroke of his pen, it could be reframed into a public insult. In Ems, a courteous encounter produced nothing more than diplomatic stalemate. On Bismarck's desk, That stalemate would be trimmed, colored, and released in a form designed to ignite national passions. What happens when a master strategist edits a single page of text? That question takes us to Berlin on the same July day in 1870, when King Wilhelm's telegram from Ems reached Otto von Bismarck. The message itself was not dramatic. Heinrich Abeken's report described how the French ambassador had pressed for a permanent renunciation and how Wilhelm had politely declined. It noted that the king might not see the ambassador again since the matter seemed over. Nothing in the wording suggested disrespect, insult, or tension beyond ordinary firmness. Yet the chancellor was given wide discretion over how to present this encounter to the press, and this freedom allowed him to transform dull fact into loaded provocation. Bismarck read the text with an eye not to accuracy alone, but to effect. His goal was clear. He wanted to frame the exchange in such a way that it removed all softness while leaving the core truth intact. He clipped away the courteous language, trimmed down the diplomatic phrases, and condensed an ordinary telegram into a style better suited to a newspaper headline than a royal diary. Where Wilhelm had granted Benedetti a calm farewell, Bismarck condensed it into wording that implied the king had refused to receive the French ambassador again. The nuance was striking. The original suggested a polite end to a conversation. The edited version suggested a blunt dismissal delivered with finality. This sharpening was not an accident. Bismarck understood the politics of perception. He knew that his king had behaved honorably and that Benedetti had conducted himself with seriousness. But he also knew that honor would mean something different once the text circulated in Paris and Berlin. By cutting out the polite connective tissue of the encounter, he created sentences that rang with contrast. France appeared insistent, Prussia appeared steadfast. The same words of decline transformed from a calm decision into a headline of rejection. Historians later noted how Bismarck described this maneuver. He admitted he wanted to rouse indignation in both capitals. In France, the people would see the king's reply as arrogant, a calculated slight at a proud nation. In Germany, readers would see Wilhelm standing firm against foreign pressure, refusing to be pushed into concessions. Each side would find in the shorter telegram something to stoke its own suspicions and passions. That was the essence of the calculation. Turn an ordinary cancellation of further talks into an offense against collective pride.
What this shows is the unusual power of editing.
The facts themselves did not change. Wilhelm had not promised, and Benedetti had not obtained what Paris wanted. Those points remained, but the tone shifted from polite closure to clipped refusal. That tone made all the difference. We sometimes think armies alone move history, but here the shift of a few words created the spark of confrontation. An ordinary chat became a national insult because the framing stripped the diplomacy out of the language. Consider the effect on readers. In Paris, the short lines read like a humiliation, a king dismissing France's representative as though he were unworthy of attention was intolerable to a people already sensitive about prestige. In Berlin, the same lines resonated like a heroic stand. The German public saw that their monarch would not bend before French maneuvering, and they admired the strength implied in his refusal. Across the border, those who felt anxious about French aggression now saw proof that their king would hold fast. A condensed telegram, a few sentences long, succeeded in producing immediate contrast, offense on one side, triumph on the other. The consequence was rapid. Newspapers spread the text, and the public digested only the edited style, not the original circumstance. Conversation in cafes, reactions in parliaments, rumors in barracks, all circulated around this sharper version. Diplomats who had heard that the meeting at Ems was polite now had to work against a printed reality that suggested insult. No one wanted to appear weak when pride was at stake, and once the papers adopted the edited form, it was impossible to step back. The most striking part is that Bismarck did not invent anything false. He adjusted language, not facts. This distinction matters, for it shows how much weight tone alone can hold. A sentence of courtesy can be reshaped into a sentence of defiance without changing what was agreed. This skill gave Bismarck what armies could not, a trigger delivered to both capitals at once. The Ems Dispatch, as it came to be called, demonstrates that diplomacy can be fought on the battlefield of words as much as on the field of battle. By altering the balance of phrasing, Bismarck lit the fuse he wanted. The reaction from France was of wounded pride. The reaction from Germany was of resolve. Both were exactly the passions that ensured the confrontation would not end quietly. And yet, as powerful as his edict was, another force was about to magnify its impact even further. A small mistranslation would soon slip into the French version of the text, distorting the king's actions in a way Bismarck himself had not planned, giving the outrage an even sharper edge.
Could a single mistranslated word help spark a war?
The answer takes us into the peculiar aftermath of Bismarck's famous edict. His shortened release of the king's telegram already set doubting minds ablaze. But when the text crossed into French, a subtle detail slipped into the translation. It was an error so small it might pass unnoticed by a casual reader. Yet its impact was immense. Translators in Paris who rushed to make the dispatch ready for the French press stumbled over the word adjutant. In German, it clearly meant a senior aide-de-camp, someone close to the king with a high and trusted position. But in French usage at the time, adjutant suggested something much more modest, no more than a sergeant. That shift downgraded the rank of the man involved in Wilhelm's farewell and made the French ambassador look as though he had been brushed aside by a junior officer, rather than dismissed with courtesy from the monarch himself. This nuance mattered profoundly in a society steeped in questions of honor. Imagine being told that your most senior diplomat, sent on behalf of the Emperor of France, had been dismissed, not tactfully by a king, but hastily waved away by someone comparable to a low-ranking officer. It was not only discourteous, it appeared like calculated disdain. Parisians did not need much coaxing to read the telegram as humiliation. The French press, active and excitable, gave the mistranslation full weight. Newspapers began writing as though Wilhelm had delivered a slap to French honor on purpose. The timing added layers to the interpretation. The release came on July 13th, the day before Bastille Day, the most symbolic date in the French Republican calendar, even under Napoleon III's empire. Crowds were already spirited. Gatherings across Paris expected speeches, military parades, and comments about prestige. To have this telegram appear, suggesting that their ambassador had been sent packing by what looked like a minor officer, was almost unbearable timing. Reading the morning journals, people in cafes and clubs voiced outrage. The conversation was not about Spanish succession anymore. It turned on whether France could accept being mocked on the eve of its national anniversary. Historians underline how volatile public mood had become by that week. For months, newspapers had been speaking of German arrogance. Satire depicted Prussia as an upstart challenging the old order. Athletes, barristers, and shopkeepers all repeated the phrase, national honor. When the mistranslated telegram circulated, it seemed like the material proof of what had been feared, a deliberate slight at France, staged to humiliate. In Berlin, few noticed the shift in wording. But in Paris, the translated form took hold of opinion far faster than the cautious statements from the foreign ministry could control.
The effect of a single mistranslated rank demonstrates the butterfly effect in political history.
No new content was added, no false story invented. Yet the difference between the king's adjutant and a sergeant recast how the public saw the entire meeting at EMS. The original account could be read as stiff formality. The mistranslation made it into a petty insult. Multiply that insult across hundreds of thousands of readers on Bastille Day, and the outcome was fury. Crowds shouted insults against Prussia. Opposition speakers demanded action. Regime loyalists agreed that the honor of France was at stake. It was no longer a decision for careful diplomats alone. Napoleon III's government, uneasy and under pressure, found itself trapped between international calculation and domestic pride. If they retreated now, if they accepted the idea that their ambassador had tolerated such treatment, the emperor's reputation might collapse entirely. What this shows is how public opinion, once unleashed,
can corner governments into decisions they might otherwise hesitate to make. Diplomats may wish to buy time, but noisy streets can deny them space. In mid-July 1870, ministers in Paris studied military readiness while newspapers spread phrases like, "France has been insulted." The edited telegram had already set the tone. The mistranslation magnified it. The issue was not now about Spain, not even about diplomacy. It was about whether the empire could stand by after being supposedly mocked before Europe. France's leaders therefore faced an impossible calculation. To yield would be to submit to humiliation. To resist meant war. In such an atmosphere, hesitation itself became untenable. For each day brought new demonstrations. The emperor's illness, his weakening voice in politics, and the restless ambition of nationalist deputies in the legislative body all converged. They would demand action. They would insist that France could not pause or seek calm answers. By mid-July, the idea of backing down had evaporated. So, from a mistranslated word amplified in the press, came a tide of anger no official could stem. Within 6 days, that anger swelled into declarations of war. A calm morning conversation beside a spa's fountain, reframed and mistranslated, had ignited the passions of two nations and pushed Europe into conflict.
What began as a few sentences ended with an empire crowned in Versailles. On July 19, 1870, with public pressure surging and newspapers shouting that French dignity had been slighted, the government in Paris declared war on Prussia. For Napoleon III, it was both a gamble and in many ways a corner into which he had been pushed. Honor had been framed as non-negotiable, and to retreat would have threatened not just prestige, but his rule itself. Across the Rhine, Bismarck saw the declaration land as the confirmation of what he had hoped for. France, not Prussia, would appear as the aggressor. The southern German states, long hesitant about alignment with Berlin, could now rally under the banner of collective defense. The atmosphere at the beginning of the campaign was charged with opposing certainties. In Paris, confidence ran high. Memories of French victories from earlier decades remained part of national pride, and many believed the war would be short, manageable, and perhaps even popular enough to restore the faltering image of the emperor. In Berlin, calculations were more disciplined. Bismarck had prepared for exactly this moment by establishing the North German Confederation and cultivating military reforms guided by Helmuth von Moltke. Instead of France facing a divided Germany, they now confronted a coordinated coalition. The southern kingdoms, Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden, quickly declared support, transforming a regional rivalry into a German war of unity. Events on the battlefield soon undermined France's initial confidence. Mobilization exposed weaknesses in the imperial army. Disorganized supply routes, outdated rifles issued unevenly, and an officer corps riddled with political appointments rather than ability. By contrast, Prussian-led forces moved with precision, aided by effective railway organization that transported troops swiftly to the front. The war's first encounters revealed a harsh truth. What Napoleon III had announced as a crusade for honor turned into a series of defeats that disrupted French momentum. The decisive break came only weeks later. At the Battle of Sedan in early September, French forces, trapped and encircled, faced destruction. Napoleon III himself was present, and after hours of pressure, surrendered with an army of more than 100,000 men. The humiliation was profound. For the French people, the sight of their emperor in captivity symbolized collapse. For Bismarck, it confirmed not only Prussia's military advantage, but also the exposure of the Second Empire's fragility. News of Sedan spread rapidly. Honor that had been defended through war was now recast as catastrophe. The empire fell, protests spread through Paris, and the Third Republic replaced Napoleon's regime. And yet, the war did not end with the emperor's capture. Paris, declaring itself the defender of the nation rather than its fallen ruler, resolved to resist. The German armies advanced, surrounding the capital, beginning a long and difficult siege in the autumn of 1870. For months, Parisians endured hunger,
cold and aerial bombardment from new weaponry such as explosive shells. Food shortages became legendary, with records describing the eating of horses, dogs, and in extreme cases, even zoo animals. The endurance of the city demonstrated that while prestige battles could begin wars, the reality of modern conflict would grind populations into hardship. Still, the outcome was already leaning heavily in Prussia's favor. The superior organization of Moltke's forces, backed by industrial support from the German states, meant time worked against France. By January of 1871, after heroic but futile attempts to break the siege, Paris finally capitulated. The timing was deliberate. German leaders wanted the climax of the war not only to display victory, but to present political transformation. On January 18, 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, German princes gathered to proclaim the creation of a German empire. Wilhelm I took the title Emperor, crowned not in Berlin, but in the very heart of France's symbolic architecture. That choice carried more than ceremonial weight. Proclaiming a new empire within Versailles, a monument of French grandeur, was a statement. Germany had risen, unified, and done so at France's expense. Photographs and descriptions from the day captured rows of German officers and ministers, banners commemorating victory, and echoes of chants proclaiming the Kaiser. It was both practical, the sealing of a new federal structure, and theatrical, the staging of triumph in the mirror of former French glory. What this shows is the disproportionate power of the Ems Dispatch. The war was fought with rifles, artillery, and sieges, but the decision for war began with the perception shaped by that edited text. Bismarck did not chart every battle or design every political shift, but he seized opportunity at precisely the right moment. By releasing the words he did, in the way he did, he created conditions under which France declared war, seeming the aggressor, ensuring the southern German states aligned with Prussia. In turn, military victory then translated into political unity.
The consequence was profound. Europe's balance of power shifted permanently. The France of Napoleon III lay broken, replaced by a republic trying to recover from defeat and the loss of Alsace-Lorraine. The Germany of 1871 stood unified, industrially formidable, and crowned in Versailles as empire. A telegram of a few clipped sentences had reached far beyond its literal meaning, serving as the match for war and the foundation for nationhood. One edited message gave Prussia the war it needed to forge Germany into a single empire. And the story leaves us considering how fragile peace can be when pride and words alone are enough to tip nations into conflict. The Ems Dispatch shows how a short message, sharpened and reframed, can shift history as much as armies do. What seems minor in form can become decisive in effect. Bismarck's edits, small in scale, ignited outrage and altered the map of Europe. The butterfly effect in history is often carried not by swords, but by sentences. If words could trigger the birth of Germany in 1871, we must ask what messages today carry similar hidden weight. History reminds us that peace does not always rest on treaties or battles. Sometimes it hangs by a few reshaped lines of text.